Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today, in the midst of a heat wave, I am coming to you with my weekly reads, and this is a week that is basically the beginning part of which I did a lot of reading in, I don't know if prepositions worked in that sentence, and the later part I just haven't really read anything, so fun times for everybody. But I've had a really fun reading week this week. A few kind of books related to certain prizes, a few just advanced copies of books that I sort of finally caught up with, and then just a few other ones just for sort of sheer joy. So there we go, let's get started. First up, I read The Mixed Race Experience by Naomi and Natalie Evans. And this is a non-fiction book. It's due to come out, I think, fairly soon. And it is basically looking into various parts of the mixed race experience. So interviewing various people who are mixed race to talk about what that looked like for them. So that is a wide range of people. That's sort of people who grew up mixed race in small towns or villages, people who grew up mixed race in big cities. It also looks at intersections around gender, around how that experience might be different for people who read very differently to other people. So, you know, people who pass, quote unquote, as white, people who would read as black, people who sort of read as another race. But also looking at sort of really interesting intersections about how their families talk about race, how other people around them talk about race, what the kind of conversations are, how they kind of came to find themselves. And there are some really interesting parts as well, because Naomi and Natalie Evans, the authors of this book, their mother is white, and so they talk quite a few times to her throughout the book around her experiences and sort of the family dynamic of them being a mixed race family as well, which is really fascinating. So yeah, I just a really interesting book, and I'm glad I checked it out. Quite a quick read as well, but a really vital part of the conversation as well. Next up, I read Class, a graphic guide by Laura Harvey. And so this is kind of similar to some of the other graphic novels or graphic guides I've read recently, looking into sort of sexuality or gender or various other things. Class, as the title may suggest, looks into class. And this is an area that I don't really know all that much about, and sometimes find quite difficult to sort of really pin down. And I say this as somebody who has this somewhat ridiculous accent. I've sort of grown up in a sort of fairly working class area, but have some parts of my family who are middle class, some who are working class. I'm kind of left in this sort of weird bit in between where I'm pretty much middle class or sort of lower middle class, but we also don't really have money. And so class is a really complicated thing. And I think what this book does really well is sort of unpick various sort of thinkers and speakers about class and how they have unpicked and sort of delved into what class is. Is it about aspiration? Is it about sort of financial circumstances? Is it something that can ever change? Is it something, you know, all of these sorts of questions that come up in this. And so I found this really engaging and really accessible as a work looking at it, especially because it approaches it in such an interesting way. You know, we've got thinkers on class from sort of across the world, and you know, so often when we talk about class, particularly from a UK context, we only really consider many UK speakers and only really consider the very sort of nuanced way that class sort of manifests in the UK, but actually it's so much more varied than that. So yeah, really interesting book, and I'm really glad I checked it out. And similarly, another advanced copy I read this week, well, also this month, was Other Names for Love by Taymour Soomro. And this is basically a really interesting look into sexuality in Pakistan. So it's a rural Pakistan. We've got various characters, and particularly sort of parental-child relationships are a really big part of that. And we start to see how desire and love and various other things are sort of intertwined into it. And I found it quite charming as a book. I read it incredibly quickly. It was a sort of a bit of a page turner in some ways, but also really quite beautiful in how it talks a bit more broadly about sex and sexuality and what that looks like when you have to really hide identities as well. So I thought it was really quite beautiful. The next two I mentioned in my my Orwell Prize. I don't know what kind of whale song sound I was making there. My Orwell Prize video, because these were both shortlisted, and I've got one of them here, which is There Are More Things by Yara Rodrigues Fowler, and also Quen by Alice Albinia, which I'll talk about in a sec. And There Are More Things I adored. It's sort of Kieran over at Katie Books on his Discord. There's been sort of quite a lot of discussion around this book because essentially somebody posted a kind of a couple of pages from it and was sort of like, oh my god, I love this book, it's so cool. Then Kieran read it and hated it. And it turned into this thing of us all joking about the word plek, which is used in the book as a sort of, you know, onomatopoeia for sort of typing or kind of that kind of clicky sort of sound. But this book, more generally, is about two women, especially in particular, these two women in a flat share in South London. One of them has sort of come over from Brazil and sort of recently there. The other has Brazilian family but doesn't speak Portuguese, sort of feels in some ways disconnected from her Portuguese, from her Brazilian sort of family and history. And we sort of find out more and more about how these two women are interconnected, and particularly it sort of delves into a lot around the politics of both the UK and Brazil. So we get a lot, for example, mentioning the Grenfell Tower in the UK. We get a lot mentioning about sort of political unrest in the UK, things like Brexit, but we also get sort of Brazilian politics. So we get a lot around I think former President Dilma, whose surname I've just magically forgotten, but and she you know, there was a sort of vote of no confidence, all these sorts of things. And so actually it sort of marries these two things quite interestingly together, whilst also being a really fun and playful novel. So I think what I love about this feels like Ali Smith on steroids. So if you don't necessarily like Ali Smith, maybe you won't like this. But it's sort of, you know, it's really quite playful. There are lots of things where the page sort of breaks up and does different things. Quite a lot of things where it just sort of does a lot of wordplay. But I think really my, I suppose, advice going into reading this book is to sort of let yourself go into its rhythms. Because I basically read this book in two chunks. And I think that was the right decision, because you kind of need to run up at it. The book kind of gathers pace, and particularly the last 200 pages I read as pretty much one chunk, and while I was on a sort of long train journey, and that was the perfect sort of place for it, because it's such, it sort of builds to this really fast, frantic pace, and then it kind of makes certain moments towards the end just that much more powerful because of it. And I loved it. I thought it was just really fun, really clever, and just quite silly in a really good way. So yeah, there's that. And then Quen, the other book from that Orwell Prize shortlist, or finalists, I should say, I don't think they use the word shortlist, is about a group of women who have created a sort of women-only island just off the north coast of England. And the book kind of, I think, it does some really fun and interesting things in terms of exploring what it looks like for a woman to be on an island where they're suddenly not necessarily afraid of sort of men, or where they haven't got those sorts of interactions, but also how actually politically loads of people are trying to shut down the island, how actually also when you have, you know, a sort of one group of people of any sort just running an island, and particularly a small group, there are always these sort of fractions and sort of break off groups. There are these things that all sort of start to fall apart. And so I just thought it was a really engaging and interesting book. I listened to it as an audiobook, and I think that was quite a fun way of approaching it, because it does, there are bits that feel like news reports and they're kind of read out as that as well. So yeah, a really interesting book, and I'm really glad I checked that out. Another advanced copy I read was Tomorrow, Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And this is a really interesting kind of book. It's essentially watching a group of people, a group of friends, build a video game, or build several video games. And so it's really interesting, because I think so often in books, you know, you get books about people starting a band or creating a film or doing something, and video games are sort of one of those ones that never really seems to cross over into fiction in quite the same way. You don't often have people talking about video games in books in quite the same way. So really, really interesting, not only to see the sort of creative process of these characters, but also obviously there are so many natural parallels. You know, video games tell stories, they're immersive experiences. Books aim to do the same thing, you know. So it's really interesting watching this, and I think as a result we watch, you know, a lot of the inner lives of these characters as they struggle with, you know, essentially with teamwork, like teamwork and team presentations, and sort of how to negotiate working alongside a friend. But it goes so much deeper than that. We get quite a lot of the characters facing, for example, bits of sexism within the industry, or the sort of the complicated relationships that people have. So, for example, this young woman who has to sort of navigate most of the professors in the field being male, and sort of occasionally being quite lechy or sort of trying to take credit for a lot of her work, but her navigating that alongside having business relationships with those people, whilst also acknowledging that they are the gatekeepers who can potentially get their game sold, and, you know, the other ways that their sort of friendship is affected by success, and things like that. So really, really interesting and fun book, and just a really pleasurable read. I mean, despite some really quite sad moments, it's just fun watching someone basically nerd out about all of their passions and their interests. And so I really get the feeling that the author's heart went into this. You get the strong sense that she adores video games, and I've seen a few bits of the promotional material, where there's sort of, for example, there's a Game Boy cartridge that's been created as part of the marketing for this book, and so many other cool things. So yeah, it's just really fun to see her nerding out, but also just us as an audience being able to really nerd out with her. And as someone who is a somewhat casual gamer, I guess, really, really, there's sort of some Nintendo Switch games vaguely there. Also, just sort of really interesting just to see that kind of reflected in literature as well. And then next, as part of my Eurovision reading challenge, that's still happening in the background, I read 2 books by the Norwegian author, whose name I'm going to butcher, Tarjei Vesaas. And those books are The Birds and The Ice Palace, both by different translators, which I'll list just below. And these books I just thought were so interesting in so many different ways. Like in The Birds, we have this character who is sort of seen as really being quite different from other people. He's in his 40s. He is sort of seemingly unable to really engage with a lot of the world. He sort of seems almost stuck in a sort of childlike way, and his sister is sort of trying to look after him, but also trying to have her own life. So when she wants to sort of, you know, when she meets a man who she wants to sort of settle down with, he reacts quite negatively and sort of feels almost threatened, like his mother's being taken away from him, sort of thing. But also just a really profoundly beautiful, but also really heartbreaking book, in terms of how it approaches that, because he's so stuck in these ways. He's haunted by things that other people aren't. So he sort of has these constant fears around birds, hence the name, and sort of specifically like woodcocks and various other things. And he has these sort of nightmares or these visions, and nobody else can really engage with him on that, because it's so sort of, you know, it's so strong, and nobody else has really the time or the ability to be able to look after him. It's really, really heartbreaking, but a beautiful, beautiful book. And then his other book that I read, The Ice Palace, focuses on 2 young girls at school who are basically rivals, and sort of seemingly hate each other in that very school-like way of, you know, you just decide you hate someone. But there's a sort of love story that blossoms between the 2 of them, and just when it's starting to become something, one of the girls is sort of goes missing, basically. I won't spoil a lot of the part of that, but she for all intents and purposes goes missing. And then this other girl is sort of left in a situation where everyone's like, well, you hated this girl until yesterday, but now you seemingly love her, and you're really worried and missing her, and all these other things. And so we get this really rich inner life of this girl trying to navigate not telling anybody what she feels, partly because she doesn't have the words for it, partly because she doesn't really know how she feels, but also because there's so much shame around her. And navigating that was also trying to find her friend / potentially sort of lover. It's just a really beautiful book, and yeah, it was just such a stunning and gorgeous read. And also, you know, like sort of sitting there on a train reading this and just being like, oh gosh, well I might go and have a little cry now. Great. There we go. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful book. And finally, I listened to the audiobook of this, but I've sort of read bits of it sort of physically as well. Axios End by Lindsay Ellis, and sort of sort of starting disclaimer, or not really disclaimer, but I absolutely adore Lindsay Ellis's video essays that she used to do. I think she's sort of since stepped away from YouTube. I think she sort of was talking about it partly for monetary reasons, but also partly because I think she was receiving a lot of hate and a lot of backlash on things. But her video essays I always found really smart and really interesting at sort of navigating things around pop culture, but also taking pop culture really seriously. And there's something really great about that, you know. So she would look at, for example, Twilight, and she would say, actually, isn't it quite weird that, you know, yeah, granted, it's maybe not the best book ever written, but actually it gets a disproportionate amount of hate because essentially it's something enjoyed by young girls, and that's seen as sort of less than, and that's a sort of trope that sort of goes on. And so Lindsay Ellis, I find her so fascinating and so interesting as a person. And then so I was really excited to read Axios End, her book, and this book is essentially a sort of sci-fi sort of style book where she the main character is essentially acting as an interpreter for some form of alien, but there's also a sort of political sort of scandal sort of element to this as well. It's sort of set around the time of, for example, the Iraq Wars and George Bush and various other things. So we kind of get this sort of political angle of politicians trying to stay in power whilst all of this is happening. And I just found this book really kind of whip smart in the way it approaches things. It's sort of, you know, a fun and engaging story, but it also, for me, was just, it was sort of quite sharp in some of its observations about sort of wider society, particularly around politics. It sort of imagines a slightly alternate future as well, but I think what's also really clever is she's also sort of understood a lot around linguistics and how that factors into things. She's also understood quite a lot around some of the other details. And so I just found this book really engaging and really interesting. And it's also probably one of the first books, or maybe only books I think I've ever read, that has a reference to Fergalicious, the song by Fergie from the Black Eyed Peas, which is a pop culture moment that I greatly enjoy. So I think it's all very powerful and wonderful. And so those are all the books I read this week, and I realise, again, it's a lot. Many of these were very, very short, in my defence. Also, I had a lot of very long train journeys, and trains are where I seem to just sort of like buckle down and just sort of devour books. So there we go. Anyway, I hope you've had a wonderful reading week and week in general. Speak to you all soon, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.